When we talk about the world of Wales at the end of the previous century of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, we have to talk about one of the major changes that comes about in that period, and it is the activism and the demonstration of women expressing their opinions, their power, and their political advocacy in a realm that pretty much for all of recorded history up till that point had been dominated by men, and how they will force an agenda which will be very different from what we've seen in the past. And I think it's fascinating to kind of look at those things and examine what caused them and what brings us to this point. I think we have to understand that if we're going to go forward and understand things like the suffrage movement and the major players in it and what they were up to. So let's begin. Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 260, Daughters of Cambria, the Welsh Women's Movement. For centuries, the history of Wales was written as a history of men, coal miners, ironmasters, and preachers, kings, rebels, all of these things, and it was all directed by and for men. But by the 1880s, a quiet revolution was brewing in the valleys and coastal towns. Welsh women were no longer content to be the angels of the hearth, as the saying goes. Initially, they found their voice politically in activism around temperance movements, which had risen up in the early and mid-1800s. These movements were basically an anti-alcohol movement. They equated drinking with anti-religious fervor, violence, abuse, and other forms of hostility to women. And there was a belief that was transported from the United States specifically that in order to heal the home, you needed to remove drinking. And as well, that you needed to see a change in the way people acted. And it was always felt that alcohol was actually encouraging sinning, to use Christian terms. And that was a big part of the reason why this movement began and what sort of drove it forward in that period. Temperance committees were founded in the mid-century, and women were heavily involved in carrying them out. They acted in lower positions in mixed committees, but also led their own committees over time. There were some that were founded in Wales in the 1870s and earlier, but they had fallen apart simply because there wasn't enough women involved. They weren't regional or national. They were very localized, and so there wasn't the exact fervor needed to carry forward what effectively was like a missionary role to gain more followers and more people involved. That kind of thing takes a lot of effort, money, and people, and they had none of that. So they generally would eventually fall apart, such as there was one committee in Merthyr Tydfil, as an example, that ended up falling apart just simply because there wasn't enough people doing the heavy lifting. And if you've ever been involved in committees and in meetings like that, you'll find that it very heavily becomes one or two people, maybe up to 10 people get involved. And if you don't have a national movement that's evergreen in the amount of people that it's bringing in, it's very easy for those movements to fade once the major proponents are out of the way. And that's kind of what we saw here. So what we will do, though, is we're going to talk a little bit about this. These committees that involved these women were eventually turned into what became the British Women's Temperance Association, and it was founded in 1876, but it was mostly an English movement, even though it had the label British. Most of its membership was based and found in England. There was, by 1892, up to 50,000 members, but very few of them from Wales. And in England, they did come from a large portion of different parts of the society. However, as people were looking and trying to figure out ways of getting more Welsh people involved, more Welsh women involved specifically, there was efforts on a number of fronts to try and motivate more women to be involved in this group. And so both in the North and in the South, over about a 10-year period, they founded major committees that became very active. They worked with these committees to try and drive more interest and more vision, I guess I could say, to try and drive a method and message forward. The thing of it was, however, is there was still a certain category of women that this appealed to, that had the time, the effort, and the drive to do it. Typically, they were from the middle class, and they were typically nonconformists, so they weren't from the Anglican faith. They were from other Christian faiths, and that drove a lot of the perspective and a lot of the membership and a lot of the leadership, which became, as even the leaders acknowledged, something that was problematic. You weren't getting a number of views if you couldn't get everybody involved. And so there was this concept that we needed to drive this forward. The best way to do that is to actually get more women involved. And so, especially from other parts of the society, in other classes of people who aren't necessarily as involved, and have them be a part of it. So there was an active attempt to try and create a much bigger group and a much more dominant group that could be relied upon to fight the good fight, as the saying would go. So what this episode is attempting to do, of course, is to examine how Welsh women became powerful forces in activism, and some of the leaders who pushed Welsh women into being proactive suffragettes eventually along the line. Between 1880 and 1910, Wales saw a transition from what was considered to be domesticity to defiance. This wasn't just about copying what was happening in England. It was rather a movement that was rooted in, as I said, Welsh chapels, but also Welsh language and culture, and a unique form of imperial feminism that sought to prove Welsh women were the most moral and educated in the British Empire. Remember, we've had this discussion before about the English concept of what a Welsh woman is like, especially in its caricatures, and what Welsh authors and propagandists were trying to display as the Welsh woman as the center of the home, the center of domesticity, someone who is to be relied upon, that they're noble, and that they have valor and dignity, which is something that the English perception was kind of like, well, if you spoke Welsh, you were not as good or not as noble or not as upright as a British/English woman. And it was something that we saw come about in part because of what was going on with the Blue Books in the mid-1800s. Welsh women drove in part to become organized because of this perspective that came out of these Blue Books, that, or the educational review books, I guess we could also call them, because they attacked the morality of Welsh women. They claimed they lacked the English sense of propriety and had loose morals and were a ruin of the nation. These kind of perspectives drove, not only Welsh women, but Welsh people to fight back against this perception. And by the 1880s, a new generation of educated Welsh women were determined to dismantle this stereotype. They didn't just want the vote, they wanted to reclaim the honor of Wales and the honor of Welsh women who'd been derided and treated harshly in the perspective of these government agencies. This wasn't like just some random, shall we say, loser on social media spouting off some nonsense and some propaganda. This was actual official documents that were coming out claiming these things. And that in and of itself is hurtful, but it also means that people were motivated to fight against this. One of these pioneers was Rosemary Crawshaw. We mentioned her briefly before, but before the mass movements, there were individuals like her, who was a wife of an ironmaster and Merthyr, who in the 1870s and 80s established schools and was a vocal advocate for women's rights. She famously argued that a woman was expected to obey the law. She should have a hand in making those laws. Obviously, something that they were not allowed to do at this time. And it was kind of this language which drove a lot of it. Now, again, this is coming out of the more higher classes of people who, again, are in a different position from the lower classes who already don't feel listened to. Now add to it being a woman in that situation and you're even less listened to. So, of course, this started to drive some of the political discussions. And in part, this comes out of the Liberal Party. As in the late 19th century, Wales was effectively a one-party state. The Liberal Party represented the common man, very similar to what's been the case with the Labour Party since the establishment of the National Assembly/Senedd. If you want to call it by the English name Welsh Parliament, you can do that. All of those things have been very much dominated by Labour. This is the election in 2026 is the first time we're really seeing that changing. So in the 1800s, it was the Liberal Party, which was perceived as representing the common man, the nonconformist chapel, and especially the Welsh language against the Tory-leaning Anglican landowning elite, rich English people. That the Liberal Party campaigned on a platform of individual liberty and equality. For Welsh women, this rhetoric, of course, was a double-edged sword, because when you talk about equality, when you talk about individual liberty, a lot of women are going to say, hey, what about us? And, as we know from the American Revolution and subsequent Constitution, the original founders may have perceived it as being a strictly white men only sort of document, but the reality of it was later generations would perceive that to be very different. This is the same thing here. Women started to say, well, if you're talking about equality, then equality needs to equal everybody, not just who you think should be the equal people. That kind of movement started to drive a lot of change. If the Liberal Party believed that every man had the right to vote and a voice in the government, then that should obviously apply to women as well. The party then created its own Women's Liberal Association, which was meant to be as the saying goes, tea and sympathy groups, where women would help get men elected. But instead, these groups became schools for political organization. We talked about the temperance movement earlier and how it started to drive a lot of political activism. It trained women on how to lead discussions on how to reach others when you want to talk about an issue that may be controversial or maybe something that, the wider society doesn't necessarily have a big opinion on. This helps you to get that message out. If you can train people to carry the message forward, as we see in modern politics, it makes a massive difference. The Liberal Party became, of course, a catalyst, not through their support, but actually through their obstruction of this. By 1906, the Liberals had won a landslide victory, taking nearly every seat in Wales. Welsh women expected their Welsh wizard, David Lloyd George, to deliver the vote. When he prioritized Irish Home Rule and the people's budget instead, the frustration turned the movement from polite request to militant demand. Now, we've gone in and we've talked about how the temperance movement was the training ground. We talked a little bit about some of the groups that were developed, but also there are figures that are important here, one of which is Nora Phillips, who's Lady St. David. She was instrumental in bridging the gap between temperance and suffrage. She founded the Welsh Union of Women's Liberal Association in 1891, and she realized that to change laws regarding alcohol or education or women's votes, she needed to have direct political power. Quote, she once said, quote, "The women's cause is the man's. They rise or sink together, dwarfed or godlike, bond or free," end quote. As the 1900s approached, the movement became more distinctly Welsh. Women like Edith Mansell Mullen and Annie Rees argued that Welsh women had a different cultural history than their English sisters. In 1911, the Cymric Suffrage Union was formed. Their motto was Una Fethani in hearth. Oh, that she might be free. They frequently wore traditional Welsh dresses, the tall hats, the red flannel, the image of St. David's Day, and at marches in London, they wore these outfits. This wasn't just a fashion choice, it was a political statement that said, we are Welsh, we are respectable, and we demand the vote as a distinct nation. This is an important process that we're seeing develop over the early 1900s. Of course, the look of these movements were different from north to south. In the north, in Llandudno and Bangor, the movement was often led by middle-class women focused on constitutional methods, such as the suffragettes. They used the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies as a framework. In the south, the industrial valleys of Glamorgan and Monmouthshire, the movement was grittier. It was linked to the rise of the Labour Party and the Independent Labour Party. Here, women like Elizabeth Andrews from the Rhondda Valley began to connect the vote to housing, healthcare, and the poverty of the working class. And if you want to see the intersection of class and gender in Wales, Elizabeth Andrews is a great example. Born Elizabeth Williams in Huron, her life is a story of transition from chapel-based charity to hard-nosed socialism. Andrews grew up in the shadow of the coal tips. She was a dressmaker by trade and a professional that gave her unique insight into the lives of women across all classes. She saw the hidden poverty of the valleys, women who looked respectable in chapel and on Sunday, but were starving their own bodies to feed their children on Monday. Unlike the wealthy London suffragettes, Andrews believed that the vote was a tool for social survival. In her autobiography, A Woman's Work is Never Done, she captured the essence of the Welsh working class struggle. Quote, the women of the valleys did not want the vote for the sake of political abstract. They wanted it because the houses were damp, the water had to be carried from the street, and their children were dying of preventable diseases. End quote. By 1908, Andrews moved away from the Liberal Party. Finding it too middle class, she began to be a key figure in the Independent Labour Party. She was one of the first to argue that women's issues, such as maternity care, pithead baths for minors, so women didn't have to boil water at home, and housing were in fact political issues. In other words, things that the upper and middle classes wouldn't necessarily think about or consider when they're talking about these issues. Simply the right to vote wasn't enough. There had to be more. At the other end of the social spectrum was Margaret Haig Thomas, later known as Lady Rhondda. If Elizabeth Andrews was the heart of the valleys, Margaret was the fire of the elite. The daughter of D.A. Thomas, a powerful coal magnate and Liberal MP, Margaret was raised in the lap of luxury at Llanwern House. However, she felt stifled by the Victorian expectations of being a decorative ornament, as she would say. Her catalyst came in 1908 when she and her mother, Sybil Thomas, joined the Women's Social and Political Union. For Margaret, the movement was an escape from a, in quotes, living death of boredom. Margaret Thomas brought a corporate efficiency to the movement. She organized the WSPU in Newport and pushed for a more aggressive stance against the Liberal government. In her memoirs, This Was My World, she reflected on the transformation of the Welsh women during this period. Quote, I had been taught that a lady should never raise her voice or be seen in the newspapers. The suffrage movement taught me that a lady's duty was to be a citizen first and a lady never. End quote. By 1910, Margaret was coordinating mass rallies. She was instrumental in the tax resistance movement, arguing that if women were not represented, they should not be taxed. She represented a new generation of Welsh women who were willing to break the law to change the law, a far cry from the temperance tea parties of the 1880s. The year 1910 marks a turning point in the story. In November, a delegation of women marched on Parliament. The resulting violence, known as Black Friday, saw women beaten and sexually assaulted by the police. The news of Black Friday, as you can imagine, and we'll probably go into more detail about it later, rippled through Wales. It radicalized the constitutionalists. Even the most conservative chapel-going woman in North Wales was horrified by the treatment of the protesters. In the wake of Black Friday, Newport became a hotbed for activity. Welsh women began to heckle Liberal ministers whenever they visited. When Winston Churchill, then the Home Secretary, came to South Wales to deal with the Tony Pandy riots, he was met by Welsh suffragettes who shouted, quote, "How can you govern the miners of Wales when you cannot even give justice to the women of Wales?" End quote. As 1910 drew to a close, Welsh women's movements had achieved something remarkable. It had united the dressmaker and the Viscount's daughter into an active and flourishing movement. It had finally done something which wasn't done with the temperance movements, which bridged the gap between social classes as well as political classes. It created an ideal and a understanding from Welsh women that may not necessarily have originated the same or had the full end goal as the same. It still drove all of them to push forward and to be more active in fighting for their own rights. The movement had successfully used the infrastructure of the Liberal Party to build its own foundation, and then used the Liberal Party's failure to justify its radicalization. By the time of the 1911 census arrived, which many Welsh women would famously boycott, the, quote, Daughters of Cambria were the most organized political force in the nation. By 1910, the Conciliation Bill, which would have granted the vote to some women, had been torpedoed by the Liberal government. The response from the Women's Freedom League and the WSPU was a stroke of marketing genius. If women don't count, then they refuse to be counted. The logic was simple. The government used the census to plan taxes, healthcare, and representation. If women vanished from the official record for one night, then they would prove how essential they were to the state. One of the most poetic acts of defiance in the entire British movement took place in Llandudno, led by members of the Llandudno's Women's Suffrage Society. A group of women decided that they would not spend the night of April 2nd, 1911, at their registered address. Instead, they climbed the Great Orme, the massive limestone headland overlooking the Irish Sea, a place we've talked about because of its links to Bronze Age history in Wales, and they ended up huddled together, hiding in a cave, literally removing themselves from civilized society. So in the morning, when the census enumerators came knocking, these women were nowhere to be found. They weren't just avoiding a form, they were reclaiming the Welsh landscape as a space of rebellion, and they were wild women who refused domestic statistics. Now, think about this. The 1911 census has become available for you to witness, so you can literally see this in our day. We can look at these numbers and see where these absences are. So it's an interesting kind of little window into this that you can kind of link to yourself. 1911 census, like all British censuses, is available online. You can usually view it through all sorts of different ways. And I would encourage you, if you have interest in family history, that might be somewhere to go. In the industrialized South, the boycotts took a more communal form. In Cardiff, suffragettes organized what were called census parties. Women gathered in large groups at secret locations, staying awake all night playing cards and drinking tea so that they wouldn't be at home to receive the enumerators. In Swansea, local press was scandalized. South Wales Daily Post reported on the absurdity of the women's actions, but the boycott succeeded in its true goal, publicity. For those who couldn't leave their homes, perhaps due to children or illness, the census itself became a weapon. Across Wales, dozens of forms were returned with slogans scrawled across them in bold ink. Quote, "I am a woman and a person, but the law does not recognize me as a citizen. Therefore, I refuse to be counted." One woman famously wrote in the infirmary column in her form that she suffered from, quote, "political blindness caused by liberal government." Of course, as this period draws to a close, we see the Welsh women's movement has completely transformed. It started in the 1880s and before that as a series of quiet, localized groups. But over time, slowly getting away from being purely a church anti-drink movement into something much more organized, much more aggressive, much more focused on an agenda which was focused on women. And the question then becomes, why was this unique? Why is this different from, say, England, where the same thing was happening and just as aggressively? Well, what made the Welsh movement different was the fact that you have the language, the use of the Welsh language pamphlets, and the Cymric identity allowed the movement to reach rural communities that the London-based versions never could. The chapel, which of course, unlike in England, the movements were often secular or Anglican, in Wales, these movements had to grapple with nonconformity, which is where most people were attending church. They used the Bible to justify the right to vote as being an important part of the discussion. And a Welsh suffragist was often three things at once: a woman, a Welsh nationalist, and a liberal or Labour reformer. These identities didn't compete, they fed into each other. And to kind of finalize the whole discussion, I wanted to bring forward a quote from a rally in Aberystwyth. And this is, I guess, a way to wrap up this particular era. She said, quote, "We are told that the Welsh woman's place is in the home. We say that the state is merely a larger home. And if it is poorly managed, it is because the mother's voice has been excluded from the conversation," end quote. So at this point, the daughters of Cambria have finally and completely found their voice. They spent 30 years learning how to organize and how to speak and how to fight for an agenda that they chose. And now the debates were getting closer and closer to the inevitable change that was coming. And I think that is something that's important. It's something that we need to be aware of because it's critical to our modern society to see how women from the past dominated the conversation of the present and how they helped to change an idea which had floated around for thousands of years that women were to be, to use that quote, seen but not heard, to be images of both sexual desire and of domesticity and nobility and all sorts of ideals and ideas that weren't necessarily in keeping with a rational argument, and one that silenced them in a way that was unfair and unequal and unnecessary. And I think that's where this begins to finally turn this all on its head. And of course, we've got a whole war to go through before we finally get through the result of all that. But I think it's important to know kind of how we started to get there and how important it is. Yes, we've had women who've had influence. Yes, we've had women that have spoke to society as a broader sense and have been influential in that society. That doesn't necessarily mean that they had a voice as a whole. It just means that particular woman did or that particular girl did. And I think it's important to understand that and understand why it's so critical to the discussion. I think it's important to remember that this all sort of revolves around the same dominant discussion, which is what is my place in society and how I'm perceived and why or why don't I have a voice in it. I think that's always important. And I think it's always necessary to have when you're talking history. You need to be able to understand all parts of it, not just what we prefer to talk about or not just what we think is history. With all that said and done, thank you all for watching or listening today. I hope this was educational, enjoyable, something you appreciated. And I hope when we talk next, we'll talk more and have even more to talk about. But with all that said and done, thank you, everybody. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me on social media at Welsh History Pod, except for on Facebook, which is the oddball, where it is Welsh, facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And if you'd like to help this podcast move forward financially, you can do so by donating via patreon.com/Welsh History. As I've said in the previous discussion episode, will be moving forward with Patreon in the next few months to try and drive its usefulness for you and hopefully for me. And I hope we'll have a good time talking about all these things. And with all that said and done, thank you once again. Have yourselves a great day. Take care. Ta-ra. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.